I was speaking on reserve forest, then protected forest, then sanctuary, then we are speaking about wildlife sanctuary, then national park, then we talked about tiger reserve, then we discussed about the act and also the ordinance and all. See, today we'll look into the governance of forest resources in India, because you see, if you'll unfold the history of forest management in India, specifically, you'll find that the forest was mostly in the hands of the community. Traditionally, the forest was in the hands of local community. The local community used to manage the forest resources for their personal use and also for the community purpose. Mostly you'll find the forest was divided as an individual rights over some patch of forest, and the another patch of forest was called as a community forest. So in both the sense, the entire community was well engaged and has developed well management system in managing the resources. And if you look into, there are lots of case studies which you to reflect that there are various communities had developed various indigenous mechanism, various traditional mechanism for the resource management on their own locality. It is not only that they used indigenous knowledge, rather they used the different kind of local system, local traditional institution that developed, which helped them in managing the forest resources. In most of the cases, you will find that the local communities worked under the leadership of the village chief, and everybody, each and every household, with the proper time schedule, contributed the physically labor and also financial contribution to the forest management. And if you look into the traditional methods or traditional mechanism or traditional institution in forest governance and forest management, you will find that throughout our country, we are not going now the global scenario, we are only confining to the country of India. So in our country only we'll discuss about. So what we found that the mechanism was quite democratic in nature. The village to take a decision in a more democratic way and giving the justice or equity to all, each and every members of the community. So that means if you look into the traditional system of forest governance, you'll find that the system was quite democratic in nature. The system was quite inclusive in nature, which has always given emphasis not only in the sense of gender, but also in the sense of irrespective of class, irrespective of caste, everybody was quite included. It is almost all the forest dwellers used to look after each other, and they were mostly working in favor of ecological sustainability. Their approach, their methods of resource management was mostly the sustainable mechanism. So they always works for the protection of the forest, not to bring any harm to the forest. That was their main intention. See, if you look at the forest resources in India specifically, you'll find that it is a major source of income and a major source of livelihood for most of the communities living just near to the forest. Mostly, almost all the tribal communities, we have 8% tribal population in the country. So almost all this 80% of the tribal population and the rest forest dwelling other communities are completely depending on forest resources for their survival. So if you look into India, we have 23.82% land is covered by the, means if you look into the geographical area is covered by the forest land. So I've told you earlier, we have mostly the two lands we usually think. One is revenue land, another is forest land. All this forest land in our country, generally the forest land used to be in the hands of forest department. But if you look into this in general, in specific, the total forest land, out of that, you'll find that 92.47% land is in the hands of forest department. 3.18% of the land is in the other government department, except this forest department, other land departments. Then 2.45% of forest land is in the hands of corporate bodies, because they might have occupied or they might have generated some forest area and all. 1.9% by the other peoples. So where the forest land is distributed. So you see, like that, if you look into the forest, we have 54.44% forest is considered as a reserve forest. 29.18% forest are called mostly the protected forest. Then unclassed forest is, that is 16.38%. We have around 87 national parks, 485 wildlife sanctuaries, which occupies around 4.57%. Then we have around 23 tiger reserves. Things are keep on adding. Sometimes the data might use to fluctuate. So, see, if you look into, since centuries, the forest plays a predominant role in the life and livelihood of these local communities who are mostly living just close to the forest. For tribal communities mostly and the forest dwelling communities, the forest is not only the means of livelihood, rather forest is not an economic entity for them, but also for a cultural entity for them. It defines their life and livelihoods. The local people's life and livelihood is completely depends on forest governance and for their survival. So that's why we should be very much careful that while looking into the forest governance and forest management in the country. However, all this traditional mechanism, the traditional institutions in the context of forest governance and forest management was weakened, was disturbed with the intervention of the British. In 1864, for the first time, the concept of forest department came to exist. Prior to 1864, there was no such concept of forest and there was no such concept of forest department. So the entire forest was in the hands of local communities who used to live nearby to that area. So they have a well management system, well distribution system. There was no much conflict among the villagers while taking the forest into account. So they used to have a kind of non-written agreement within the villages that up to this much geographical area within the forest will be occupied by you, and this much will be occupied by others. So like that, they have a different kind of distribution law. So you see, in 1864, for the first time, the forest department came to exist. By the British made their own ideas to develop this concept of forest department, and the main intention was to sustain the availability of large-scale timbers timbers to prepare the sleeper class in the railways, in the railway. So what exactly required? Their main intention was that taking the power of this forest governance and forest management to their hand from the local communities. But if you look into this history of freedom fighting movements in India, you'll find that the Britishers faced lots of difficulties while they faced the tribal communities, for which in course of time they brought the different kind of acts also, like criminal tribal acts. So the tribals who were against them, they declared them as a criminal tribes, and with the purview of the new law of Criminal Tribe Act, they took lots of action on them. So huge restriction they imposed on that particular tribals who rebel. Even if a person rebels from a particular tribal community, the entire tribal community is to be declared as a criminal tribes, and restriction is to be imposed on them. They will be deprived from all kind of facilities given by the governments. Sometimes the leader, whoever raised the voice will be imprisoned. So that was the situation. And like that, in the forest sector also, the Britishers felt that unless and until the forest land is legally being taken away from these local communities, it is quite difficult in that part to grab these forest products for the betterment of their own country. Because India was quite famous for the teak. And today, sometimes we coin the term called gambling, called smuggling and all, and the mafias, the people are taking the most of the people are being engaged in taking the uh, hunting the animals, poaching the animals, and then taking the animal products, then cutting the very costly trees. So the same thing which was made legally by the Britishers by imposing this forest department and return forest acts. That was their main intention, that how to grab these forest products from India and take away those to their own country. Specifically, they were much interested to take the large number of timbers from our country for preparing the sleepers in the railways. So, here, if you look into the main intention in 1864 was how they can shift this management of forest, the management of this forest governance from the local communities to the state. Means how the state can impose restriction, how the state can hijack the power of forest governance. So that was their main intention. If you look into 1865, for the first time, the Forest Act came to exist. And when the Forest Act came to exist, the main intention was how the acquisition of forest areas will start, how the British will able to grab the forest resources from the country and could able to supply this timber to the railways of their countries without having any kind of conflict with the local peoples. So means their main intention was how legally they can exclude these local communities from their legal rights. Because the main hindrance for them was the forest was belonged to the local community. They were the people who were controlling the resources. But by imposing this Forest Act 1865, the government started slowly taking the rights of the local communities to the state. So now the state becomes the owner of the forest. So then the forest was defined differently in the law. In the act, they defined the forest, any land which is covered with the trees and bushes and are called as a forest. Anything, anywhere there is plantation, there are trees, even some bushes are there, it is called as a forest land. So then 1878, again this Forest Act has been uh, uh, in 1878 again they brought some amendment to the Forest Act. What they did? So means learnings from some kind of experience from 1865, they tried to brought some kind of amendment, brought some kind of modification in the Forest Act, which will be more favorable to them. So what they did here, they did that any land, whatever would be designated as a forest will be designated as a forest. So means they kept it open that whatever the land they want, they can designate it as a forest. Then the second thing was in 1878, their main intention was to treat the customary right of Indian villagers as best on privilege and not on right. So what they did, so till now, till 1878 mostly, the tribal or the local communities, the tribe forest dwellers communities who are living near to the forest were mostly claiming their rights over the forest as their right. They are accessing the forest as their customary right. But the main intention of the British was how the customary right can be taken away and some kind of accessibility can be given to these communities, which will be based on the privilege, not based on the right. So the concept of privilege is based on the mercy of the Britishers to the local communities. So it means look into. So that means till yesterday I was the owner of the land, and today I can use the land, but it depends upon the mercy of the Britishers. But if they have a mercy, if I oblige them, then I can have an access. But if I will not oblige them, if I will not oblige their principles, I will be immediately thrown out from the land because my rights is being taken away in the name of governance, in the name of better management. The local communities were being recognized as threat to the forest. They don't know how to manage the forest. Because of the local communities, the forests are being deteriorating. The deforestation is rising up. These are the kind of argument from the Britishers. So the local communities, the management system should be taken away from the local communities to the state. So now the land which belongs to these local communities becomes the land of the government, land of the state, and these local communities started using this land not based on their customer right, based on the privilege. A bar to accrual of any further rights of people on reserve forests. See, again they imposed. What they did, they brought the new concept called reserve forest in 1878. What will happen? I have already told you what is a reserve forest. Reserve forest are forests where any kind of human activities are prohibited unless until permitted. What they did? To make it more and more restricted to the local peoples. Their intention was not to protect the forest, rather their intention was to restrict the people through that they will have their autonomy on forest and they can grab the forest whenever they want. So that's why they coined another concept called reserve forest. And with the reserve forest concept, they denied the accessibility of those forest communities to those forest land which are being declared as a reserve forest. And then just to show their sympathy, just to show to the public, in some places they started giving then some kind of usufruct right to specific communities who was working for them. Constitution of a third category of forest also they coined, that is called village forest. They told to the villagers, so why you are not promoting some of the local forest at your own locality, which they coined the concept called village forest. Then after 1878, in 1927, the Forest Act was again amended. And in 1927, they made some kind of clause where the British started creating some kind of confusion, creating some kind of conflict within the community. So they mostly tried to neglect the community forest rights. So they tried to neglect the rights of the communities in the forest region while they started giving more emphasis on individual forest rights. They told them the forest rights should be given to the individual uh, persons, not to the community as a whole. So that was the major kind of change. And very interestingly, 1927 to 2006, there was almost, if you look into the 80 years, even almost, if you look into 2006, so that means we have around 59 years of independence. We were not able to brought any kind of change in the Forest Act. Very interestingly, the British made the Forest Act, which was dead against to the local communities, which was being opposed by almost all the tribals and local communities who are living nearby to the forest. And all of us know that what was their intention of making all these forest acts. But very surprisingly, the government of India didn't take such a step till 2006 to alter this forest act. And that also we don't have clear-cut Forest Act in 1927, sorry, till 2006. If there was no such demands from the tribal communities, then still doubt whether the government of India could have changed this Forest Act or not. So that means it is very sorry to tell that till 59 years of independence, we had a same intention of what exactly the British did. The British ruled, gave the power of the forest to the state with the same ideology, with the same intention. 59 years of our independent ruling continued by depriving the rights of these communities. So luckily in 2006, because of huge demand from the tribal communities, huge demand from civil societies, the government brought the Tribal Forest Right Act, which we have already discussed. It is an historic act, historic judgment of giving the rights, returning the rights to this local and tribal communities, the forest dwellers. But still, the implementation is a really question mark. And still, it is a really question mark whether the rights are being well distributed or not. Whether the tribal people have received their rights or not, whether they have received the justice or not, that is also a question mark. It is high time to look into all these matters, whether the tribal communities or the forest dwellers have received their right or not, because in most of the time, what exactly happening throughout the globe, not in India, the various states brought an excellent acts, but our faulty implementation strategy, our lack of willingness to implement the project creates a real problem in proper execution of these acts. So act is quite fine, but if you look very critically, even after the 15 years of this Forest Right Act, to what extent the rights of the tribal communities and forest dwelling communities are being handed over? That is also a very big question mark. If we have failed in handing over this right in the last 15 years, which will reflect the state's autocratic and authoritarian attitude of going back, giving back these lands. So means which will reflect what the British did. We are still continuing with the same kind of ideas, ideology and mentality. So if you look into the various policies, it was not only the act, various policies, rules, regulations, then government orders has come up for the forest governance, forest management. Then 1894, the first forest policy came. And if you look at the post-independence periods, the country has adopted its policy like National Forest Policy, 1952 first forest policy came in post-independence India. Then Indian Forest Bill 1980, Indian Forest Policy 1988, then Joint Forest Management Policy came, the government order came, that is 1990. Then the Forest Conservation Act came 1980. Then if you look into this, we have also Wildlife Protection Act 1972, 1988 again some amendment. Then Forest Policy also in 1988 again we brought another forest policy. And that forest policy in 1988 gave moments, community management. So that means if you look into 1988, the forest policy after this 1927, though acts are not being amended, but in 1988, when this I told you now from 1980s, the almost all the country throughout the globe started adopting the principle of community management. They thought of how locals can be given the right to manage the resources. With that spirit, in 1988, the forest policy started speaking about the community management. Then in 1990, we brought JFM guidelines, joint forest management, that is how the forest department and the local communities can join hands together in managing the resources, forest resources. But you say, even if you look into the today also, the way the British destroyed the local institution, the way the forest department under the leadership of the British treated the local communities, the way it tortured the local communities, today it is failed to bring back and establish the path of local communities on them. Because of this around 100 years of exploitation, what 100 years more than that, because since 1865, if you look into more than 150 years, if you look at this 150 years of exploitation, has discouraged this local and tribal communities to develop such faith on forest department and work with them. So for which in most of the cases, also the joint forest management, though it has succeeded also, but in some of the cases it was quite difficult to mobilize the local communities to join hands with the forest department, because they are still not in a position to develop a faith on this forest department, because they are being exploited by them for a longer period. So the various state governments implemented this JFM. Lakhs and lakhs committees are being formed for the protection and conservation of forest resources, but ultimately the outcome is quite challenging. So which has to be looked very critically, and why these things happen in the context of forest management. And if you look at the JFM, and most of the time what happened in the JFM, it was delayed in initial approval from the state government, from district administration also, insecurity of tenure to the people, because the tenure was not well defined, how many years they will work together, lack of people's participation in planning, because it is exactly the people are not being involved in the planning levels, only in the implementation level they are being called, lack of poor cooperation among various stakeholders. Then, so access to the benefits, no clear-cut guidelines about the final benefit sharings. Then the major issues also help the local people. One very much advantage was that with the help of the local communities, the forest department will develop a 10 years micro plan. Through that, it will be an overall development of that area. And some of the major issues also we found that regarding the rights of the local communities, which was I have already told you, the people develop a kind of sense of suspension, and the JFM model also didn't completely recognize the needs and of the local communities for which the major challenge was coming up. And uh, in 2006, whatever the Forest Act has come up, so we then hope that it will give a clear justice to these forest dwelling communities and will hand over their rights, legal rights of their lands, because since 1865 they are still fighting to get over the rights of their own land, because earlier they were occupying those lands, but anyhow they don't have any records. And 2006 Act has come with a hope that the lands which are being occupied by these communities since centuries, since third generation, since 75 years, or since three generations, will be given the legal rights, through that the customer rights of the tribals and the local forest dwellers can be protected for the proper management of the forest governance. So this is the overall kind of brief note about the forest governance in the India, and the further things we will discuss in the uh, later class. Any question on this? Hello. Anybody asking anything? No.
Hello, sir.
Tell.
Sir, good morning, sir. Sir,
Huh.
is there any possible of having online exam, sir?